The Pentagon signals it is to dramatically expand the size of its cybersecurity force. Does the decision suggest a new determination by the US to wage cyber war on its enemies? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ritansi. At a time when policymakers in Washington are talking about cutting the size of the US military, the Department of Defense has signaled it is to dramatically increase the size of its cyber command over the next few years. Proponents of the plan argue it's a prudent response to the changing nature of 21st century warfare. They argue that in recent years, cyber attacks at the behest of governments have increased in frequency and ferocity. The US government only acknowledged developing cyber weapons recently, and it's never publicly admitted using them. But reporting by the New York Times last year revealed that President Obama's administration has carried out attacks on the computer systems that run Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities. US defense officials, however, point to an attack last year on the Saudi state oil company Aramco that took down more than 30,000 computers. They claim the Iranian government was responsible. Critics of the expansion of Cyber Command suggest it will mark a further threat to privacy and internet freedom. In addition, they're concerned that the National Security Agency and Pentagon, who oversee the program, lack accountability and oversight. But outgoing US Defense Secretary Leon Panetta put the threat faced by the US in the starkest terms last year.
These attacks mark a significant escalation of the cyber threat, and they have renewed concerns about still more destructive scenarios that could unfold. Collective result of these kinds of attacks could be a cyber Pearl Harbor.
To discuss this further, we're joined from Rio de Janeiro by Glenn Greenwald. He's a columnist for The Guardian. Scott Borg is in San Francisco. He's director and chief economist at the US Cyber Consequences Unit. And in the studio, Larry Korb, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and a former assistant secretary of defense. Let's begin by looking at what we think is going on at Cyber Command. It was set up in 2010. It currently employs about 900 people. And according to the Washington Post, there are plans to hire at least 4,000 additional personnel. Cyber Command plans to develop three types of force: national mission forces, which will work to protect computer systems that run electrical grids and other infrastructure deemed critical to US security; combat mission forces, which will focus on helping US commanders abroad plan and execute offensive cyber attacks; and cyber protection forces, which will focus on strengthening the computer networks of the Defense Department itself. Scott Borg, then, what do you make of these plans? Can you explain to us perhaps the thinking behind this expansion?
So the expansion is actually tiny by defense standards. Adding 4,000 people is really not all that big a deal. It's certainly not a big enough expansion for any contractors, defense contractors, or anyone else to make a huge amount of money off of. It's really kind of long overdue. We've talked about having a cyber force for quite a period of time, and if we're going to have one, it needs to have more than a few hundred people in it.
So 4,000 people, you're saying that that's not a huge expansion then?
Compared to the size of the American military and of the Pentagon itself, it is a tiny number. And given the importance of cybersecurity, given the fact that all of our defense systems depend on computers, all of our weapons, all of our military operations are completely dependent on computers. Devoting fewer than 5,000 people to cybersecurity seems, very small thing.
Glenn Greenwald, then, it would appear then that those within the military-industrial establishment, perhaps, they don't think this is a huge expansion when put into context. And you've written about your concerns. What are they?
Well, first of all, you heard the term cybersecurity used multiple times by Scott, which is always what happens with government defenders. They coin slogans that are intended to sound very harmless but are quite misleading. The United States is not engaged in the process of only defending itself or even primarily defending itself against cyber threats. The U.S. government is the single greatest menace when it comes to aggressive cyber warfare. The United States government, along with the Israelis, is really the only country ever to use cyber weapons in a sophisticated and aggressive way, just like it was the only one to use the atomic bomb, and before that was the only one to use drone warfare. So a major part of this expansion is not about protecting our businesses from attack. This is always the fear-mongering campaign the government uses to justify expansion of power and money. A big part of it is making sure that the U.S. government can continue to destroy whomever it wants at will using sophisticated cyber weaponry. And the other thing I would add is this goes all the way back to 2002, 2003 to the Rumsfeld Pentagon, when there were secret reports issued that are now declassified that talked about how we have to wage war against the net. That was the slogan, and it talked about treating the internet as a militarized battlefield and making sure the U.S. government dominates offensively. This is a continuation of that mindset, and I think 4 times greater the number than previously existed to control cyberspace under the aegis of the Pentagon and the NSA is a very big deal.
Larry Korb, is it clear then, as far as we can tell, what the balance is in policy between defensive and offensive actions? Right?
No, we don't know, and I think this is one of the problems. This is a new form of warfare, and so therefore we need to govern it. We need rules. For example, if the United States, as has been alleged, worked with the Israelis to do something, so-called Stuxnet, was that cleared with the Congress? Under what authority did they do that? Was it as a result of the fact that the Congress has passed resolutions designating some of the Iranian military forces as terrorist groups? And I think that's a key thing, as well as the whole privacy thing. We see the same thing with drones. Local police forces now want to get drones. Are they going to be spying on us? Where do we draw the line? A drone attack is an act of war. So I think that's what we really need to do as we enter into these uncharted waters.
Scott Borger, do you have a better sense then about that split between defensive and offensive operations in Cyber Command?
So there are several things here that are being kind of confused and a lot of issues being raised at once, and I think it might be helpful to separate them out a little bit. The United States does not currently seem to have any kind of well-thought-out strategic cyber policy. We are engaging in various kinds of cyber actions without any extensive public discussion, without any clear policy, even in the White House, as far as I can tell, about what we should be doing, how we should be using these weapons, what we should be using them for, and so on. This is a bit as though we were deploying tactical nuclear weapons without having had a Hiroshima and with no appreciation for how profoundly important these things could be. So I think we urgently need a national cyber policy, and we need to talk about what's missing there and what we need to do to develop it. This is very different than the question of should our military add a few thousand cyber specialists to the rest of all the military that we've got, which I think is a small thing and something long overdue, actually. The application of American national cyber capabilities to defend things, like to defend the power grid, as was mentioned, is a different issue still. If it were possible for the NSA and Cyber Force to defend the power grid by monitoring traffic and so on, we could be discussing whether they should be doing that. In fact, we have no capability of doing that. We can scan all of the traffic and we can't identify malware. Malware can be described, malware meaning malicious programs, can be disguised in such a way that you can look right at it and you can't tell what you're looking at. So we could have a huge loss of liberty, a huge loss of privacy, and gain nothing from it as far as defending critical infrastructures are concerned. The problem with all of these things is just so much confusion and so little understanding of what's technically possible.
I think what's interesting then is who is driving policy then in the absence, perhaps, of a really well thought out framework. And I wonder, Glenn, you've written about the revolving door between Washington politicians and the White House and these private security contractors who, after all, are a bit scared right now that they might be facing cuts in conventional warfare, in particular the role of Booz Allen, the consulting firm, and retired Vice Admiral Michael McConnell. I mean, I suppose we have to wonder whether there's that danger then in the absence of a proper, well-thought-out framework that, in fact, actually this will just be driven by the profit motive on the part of the contractors who have very close contacts with the administration.
Let's just look at the culture in which this expansion is taking place. It's being done, as I indicated earlier, under the aegis of the National Security Agency and the Pentagon, two of the most secretive agencies in all of the federal government. They operate with extreme levels of secrecy without virtually any real democratic accountability, oversight, or checks. They have checks only in the most theoretical sense. And what I think is so critical to note is that especially the NSA, but also the Pentagon, has been engaged in a very intensive privatization campaign where so many of its functions are privatized, outsourced to private industry. And you have huge associations that are devoted to doing nothing other than accelerating the merger, which is really what it is, between the private sector and the US government. When it comes to all these functions, it's incredibly lucrative for industry. And you referred to the revolving door. What you have are people like Admiral Mike McConnell, who is now at Booz Allen, who was previously the director of national intelligence under George Bush, who prior to that was also at Booz Allen, involved in these campaigns simultaneously to scare the nation into believing that we have to dramatically increase our cyber defense infrastructure, while at the same time representing the very industry interest who will profit immensely from that expansion. The entire culture of the NSA and the Pentagon is very much one where the revolving door ensures that these expanding contracts are very rarely for the public good and always for the good of private industry. And when you add to that what Larry Korb said, which is that all of this takes place in total secrecy, without any transparency, with no real legal framework, the assumption that this is going to be on the up and up and done in an entirely proper way is completely unwarranted. That's not how our government works. That's not how power and profit are exercised when done in the dark.
Larry Corbin, yet you are in favor of this expansion of cyber command.
I am.
Put our fears to rest then. How can we trust those who are
Well,
in it?
again, you get, we're talking about comparatively small. Yes, I mean, some people are going to make some money off of this thing, but, the Pentagon, if you count active duty, reserve, and civilians, that's 3 million people. This is going to be, a little over 4,000. There will be some contracts, but it's not going to be anywhere near what the Joint Strike Fighter is for example. So I think that's the point, though. Okay, we're going to go forward. Have we thought it out? As my colleagues have pointed out, what's our overall plan? When will you know when you're there? I mean, and do you have that many people you can hire? One of the things is, well, we're going to expand to 4,000 people. Do you have that many people that you can get? And then, of course, you have the whole question of the revolving door. I mean, it's not just in this area. A lot of other areas where we need to, I think, enforce it more quickly. In fact, during the run-up to the Gulf War, we found out a lot of military people who were working for contractors were on television talking, about. So, I mean, there's a lot of things, and we need to do that not just in this area, but a lot of other areas.
But Scott Borg, I mean, are you suggesting, though, that perhaps partly because this is being driven by the hunger for profit of military contractors, that a lot of what's being said actually isn't true? Even if the government and Cyber Command did want to fundamentally re-engineer our experience of the internet nominally to protect the US's strategic interests, they probably can't do it yet anyway? Is that what you're suggesting, that we have to take a lot of what's being said with a pinch of salt?
So there isn't an enormous amount of money to be made from hiring 4,000 more people. If we're looking at the big defense contractors, this is very small-time stuff for them. This is not something that's going to pay the salaries of people like Mike McConnell for years to come, at least not very many of them. So the motive here is not as straightforward as defense contractors just trying to make a lot of money. The ability of the American government to do anything here is very limited. One of the reasons that they will be hiring their 4,000 more people over several years is that there aren't 4,000 people out there to be hired in this field. There aren't 4,000 cyber experts to spare. We have a great shortage of talent in this area. We have no unemployment in this field. We've got all kinds of jobs that are open right now that are going begging. We need most of our cybersecurity experts to defend our businesses, our critical infrastructure industries, so we can't spare them for the defense, for the government. That's actually not as high a priority as defending these critical infrastructures domestically. So, and the government has very limited control over the internet altogether. The internet is almost entirely in private hands. Not only that, but all government IT expenditure is very small. The entire federal government, including the Defense Department, is only 5% of the market for information technology. If you're a large contractor in this field, if you're IBM, the federal government is literally only 5% of your business. So the federal government is not all that big a deal in many respects here.
Okay, but the one thing we do know, amidst all, all the unknowns, is that the US, it does appear to be the US that is driving the sort of the new arms race on the internet forward with its deployment of viruses and Stuxnet and Flame and things like that. I mean, that is incontrovertible, isn't it? So shouldn't we have alarm bells ringing as we look at the employment of all these new people as to what exactly their motivations are? Scott?
We definitely need some kind of national policy for this, and the national policy needs to be discussed publicly. In a democracy, it's not ever a good idea to make anything secret until you've had a public agreement about what you're trying to do and what it is you're going to make secret. We need to figure out what we're doing here, and we're not. We're deploying cyber weapons for tactical gains without any broader picture of the consequences of what's going on. We're also not doing this very effectively. If Flame, for example, a piece of a malicious program that was launched on the world, if Flame is a product of the American government, as reported in the news media, this was a demonstration of a lack of understanding of these weapons and what they can do. Flame was a very versatile, very large, modular cyber attack weapon. It was launched on the world with no code obfuscation. In other words, it was launched in a form that would allow potential adversaries to reuse it, to turn it against us, to retarget it. This was completely unnecessary. Flame could have been launched the way Microsoft launches their software, their operating system, in a form that made it almost impossible for anybody to reuse it, to figure out how it worked and what it meant. So we've got weapons that are being used without a policy for using them. We've got no long-term sense of where this is going, no good public discussion of this. And we don't have these weapons being deployed in a very informed way. One of the impediments to any good public discussion of this is people using old ideologies left over from the Cold War, to immediately choose sides without adequate understanding of just what's going on, what's possible, what's real, what's not. We've got people sounding off on this at all levels, from all sides and all parties, with no understanding of the technology.
So, Glenn, I mean, that suggests things are a little worse than perhaps you've described in your fears, which are, putting this in the context of a national security state that some would argue is as out of control in its surveillance of all of us and so forth. It's worse than that. They don't actually know what they're doing.
Well, I think it's very tempting to ascribe that kind of innocence to the U.S. government. The reality, though, is just look at what we do know about what the U.S. government is doing in this field. It is vastly different than the sort of fantastical descriptions that we just heard. The Washington Post, in its 2010 Top Secret America series, reported that every day, every single day, the NSA collects and stores 1.7 billion, that's with a B, billion, email exchanges and other forms of electronic communications between Americans and others in the world. The Obama administration has been attempting in all sorts of ways to ensure that it has full and complete and unfettered access to all forms of communication on the internet. It just extended for another 5 years what was controversial 4 years ago but no longer is, which is the ability of the U.S. government to engage in warrantless eavesdropping on electronic communications. And what we also know is that while the U.S. government and its defenders are standing up and saying that this expansion of this policy is necessary to protect the United States from cyber threats, what we know is that the only true cyber threat that the world has ever seen that has actually manifested in the world has come from the United States as the aggressor. And, Larry Korb earlier said, well, we're not really sure if it's legal. What we know is that the Pentagon itself says that cyber warfare is an act of war. We're not at war with Iran. There's no congressional authorization to use military force against Iran, and yet what we know is that the United States government unleashed an extremely sophisticated computer virus that it developed with its private sector partners in order to destroy what the U.S. government admits is a legal program of enrichment. And so it is the United States that already has proven itself as the aggressor in this field. They themselves admit that part of this expansion is to intensify that aggression. And so the fact that this is all being done in secret and we don't have transparency is a reason to be more concerned about it, not less concerned, given the track record of the U.S. in this realm.
Scott Borg, you better respond to that, and then Larry, I'll come to you. But Scott.
So we have a number of nation states that are engaged in very extensive cyber activity. The largest scale cyber campaign in the world is a long-term ongoing campaign being carried out by China to steal all of the technology, all the competitively important business information from the Western world. This is just enormously larger in scale.
Right, but that's cyber espionage, not cyber warfare, arguably perhaps, right? Or is there a distinction? Aren't we doing the same thing?
There is no longer a tenable distinction between espionage and seizure of property. If your economic future depends on your information, if your defense systems depend on your information, the security of that information, and you seize that information, that's seizing something of great value. That's a bigger deal than seizing a military base or seizing a warship or It is actually a much bigger deal. It used to be that there was a difference between reconnaissance and seizure of property. There isn't anymore. In an information age, reconnaissance is seizure of property.
Larry Korb, your thoughts then?
Well, I agree with Glenn that, in fact, the Chinese are doing things. And remember, this cyber command is also going to be defensive. Going back to, what Glenn said, if, in fact, we were involved doing this against Iran, we have procedures that you have to notify the intelligence community. I don't know if they did. I hope that they did, and the intelligence community had to approve it. But I think this is the problem we have. Ever since 9/11, we had the Patriot Act that allows us to do things without, getting the permission from the judges. And so we got to go back and make sure our system works. And we can't use the same things we did when they were talking about, should we stage a coup here or something, something like that. So I do think we do need, and it's up to Congress and the courts to step up and make sure, because even though the money comparatively, as Scott said, of the $700 billion defense budget, small, the ramifications could be great, both at home and abroad.
And I suppose the problem is that no matter what your opinion is of the need for cyber command, Glenn, none of this debate is then happening, as far as we can tell, at least in public.
Sure. There's zero transparency. We learned today, as a result of what is an anonymous official going to the Washington Post, it's unclear how authorized it is, that this program is going to be implemented, but here we are talking about this program, and you asked each of us what the division is between offensive and defensive capabilities, exactly what it is that it entails. We know that there's going to be 4,000 more employees of the government devoted to this, which is a fourfold increase, but we don't know how many new programs there will be, how many contracts there will be, what those contracts will be for, whether it's subject to any legal accountability or framework. Nobody can answer the question that you're asking because it's all completely opaque. And that's to be expected because this world, the world of the NSA and the Pentagon, is in virtually every respect completely secret and opaque. It operates with very little democratic debate, democratic discussion, or democratic accountability. In fact, the only reason that we know that the United States unleashed the first ever sophisticated cyber attack on another sovereign country is because someone in the government told the New York Times that this had happened. And the Department of Justice and the Obama administration is so infuriated by this leak that the Washington Post reported just this weekend that they're going through people's emails in massive scale in order to find out who that leaker was and to prosecute them. So what little we know is already coming from unauthorized leaks that the Obama administration is desperately trying to plug. We're not headed in the direction of more transparency. We're headed in the direction of more secrecy, more prosecutions for leaks, more intimidation of whistleblowers, and that's why this is so concerning.
Glenn Greenwald, thank you very much. Scott Borg, thank you. Larry Korb, thank you as well. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.